I was up before the sun, same as always. That never changed, not before everything fell apart and not after. If anything, the collapse made the routine more important, not less. Routine was the difference between a man who was managing and a man who was sliding, and I had no intention of sliding. I pulled on my work boots in the dark, laced them by feel the way I had done 10,000 times, and stepped out onto the porch to check the sky. Clear, cold enough to see my breath, but not cold enough to worry about the seedlings in the low tunnel out past the main garden beds. I stood there for a minute just listening, the way I always did first thing. Listening was free, and it told you more than any piece of equipment I owned. The property was quiet. The goats were moving around in their pen, which was normal. The chickens hadn't started yet, which meant nothing had gotten into the coop overnight. I let out a breath and went to work. The morning chores ran the same order they always did. I started at the chicken coop, unlatching the door and letting the 6 of them out into the enclosed run, while I checked the nesting boxes and collected what they had left me overnight. 3 eggs. Not a great haul, but not nothing. I noted it in my head the way I noted everything, tracking the patterns, watching for drops in production that might signal stress or illness before it became a real problem. Then I moved to the goats. I had 4 of them, 2 does and 2 wethers I kept mostly for the company and for the work they did keeping the grass down along the fence line. The does I milked every morning and every evening without exception. It was about 2 quarts total on a good day, and I used every bit of it. What I didn't drink, I was turning into soft cheese, using a simple process I had practiced for years before I ever needed it. I wasn't wasting anything. Waste was a luxury that belonged to the old world. After the goats, I walked the fence line, all 340 feet of it. I did this every morning without skipping, rain or shine, or whatever passed for weather these days. The fence was 8 feet of welded wire with a strand of barbed wire along the top, and it had held up fine so far. But fine so far was not the same as fine forever, and I knew better than to assume. I checked every post, every connection, every place where the ground had shifted or something might have pushed against the wire from the outside. There were signs, sometimes marks in the dirt, grass pressed flat. Twice in the past month I had found handprints on the outside of the wire, low down, like something had crouched there for a while. I didn't think much about what that meant anymore. I just noted it and moved on and made sure the fence was holding. The garden took up most of the late morning. I had about 1/3 of an acre under cultivation, which sounds like a lot until you are the only one eating from it, and you start doing the math on calories and variety and what you need to get through a full year. I had learned early that calories were priority and variety was a luxury, but I had managed to hold on to both so far. The raised beds along the south side of the house were producing well. Kale, chard, a late planting of carrots that was coming in slower than I wanted. The main beds further out were mostly garlic and onions at this time of year, overwintered and not far from ready. I had a cold frame along the east wall with lettuce and spinach that had been keeping me in greens for weeks. I weeded. I checked the soil moisture. I repaired a section of row cover that had torn loose at one corner. Normal work. Quiet work. The kind of work that kept my hands busy and let my mind run its own course. By early afternoon, I had eaten lunch. A simple thing. Eggs from the morning scrambled with some dried herbs and a heel of sourdough I baked twice a week, and I was moving through the secondary tasks that fill the middle part of every day. I had firewood to split and stack. I had a slow leak in the secondary rainwater tank that I had been nursing, along with a patch that needed to be redone properly before the rainy season hit. I had a list in my head that was always longer than the daylight available to work through it, and I moved through it the same way I did everything, methodically, without rushing, without stopping to think too hard about why I was doing it or what it was all for. I knew what it was for. It was for tomorrow. It was always for tomorrow. I had found the radio frequency about 4 months after things went fully dark. I wasn't looking for company exactly. I was looking for information, weather patterns, reports on movement in the area, anything that would help me make better decisions about what I was doing out here. What I found instead was a loose scattering of voices, people who had survived for the same reasons I had, who had been eating clean and living off their own land or their own stores and had come to the prion wave intact. We didn't have a formal check-in time at first. People just talked when they felt like talking. But over the weeks, it had settled into something closer to a schedule. Evenings, mostly, after the work was done and before full dark, I would sit down at the radio in the back room, the one I had powered off my solar bank, and I would listen more than I talked, which suited me fine. There was a woman named Vera somewhere up in the hill country who had a sharp mind and a dry way of talking that I respected. There was a man named Curtis who had been a contractor before everything fell apart and who was endlessly practical in a way that reminded me of myself. There was Ray, who talked too much and asked too many questions, but who had a good heart as far as I could tell, and who always seemed to know what the weather was doing 3 days out, which made him useful. And then there was Levi. Levi was different from the rest of us, where Vera and Curtis and Ray and I were all staying put, dug in, managing our spaces and our supplies and our routines. Levi was moving, had been moving since the beginning, by the sound of it. He never said exactly where he was headed or what he was looking for, and I hadn't asked. People out here didn't ask those kinds of questions. You took what someone offered, and you didn't push for the rest. What Levi offered was a voice that came on late, after the main check-ins were done and the others had signed off, and what it started bringing to those late-night transmissions had changed the texture of everything. He had found the journals about 6 weeks ago. He didn't say exactly where, just that he had been working through an abandoned research facility, looking for medical supplies, and had found a room that hadn't been touched. A desk with a locked drawer that wasn't hard to open. Inside were several composition notebooks, handwritten, dense, dated entries going back almost 4 years before the collapse. The name on the inside cover was Dr. Arnold Phelps. Levi had started reading them that same night and had not stopped since. The first time he brought them up on the radio, I had almost dismissed it. People found things out there, journals and diaries and notes, and most of it was personal grief, not information. But Levi had read the first few lines of the first entry aloud, and something in the language of it had made me sit forward in my chair. This was not a personal diary. This was a man writing down what he knew in the way a scientist writes things down, precisely, with dates and references and a careful clinical distance that started fraying around the edges the further into the notebooks Levi got. I had listened to him read the first entry twice that night, lying in bed afterward with the ceiling dark above me, turning the words over in my head. That had been 6 weeks ago. Tonight would be the 7th report. I finished the last of my evening chores as the light was going, locking the chickens into the coop, checking the goats one final time, doing a last walk of the near perimeter with a flashlight kept low. Everything was as it should be. I went inside, washed up, ate a simple supper, and then settled into the chair in the back room with the radio, already warm from standby. Vera checked in first, said the weather looked stable for the next few days. Curtis had a question about seed storage that I answered briefly. Ray talked for a while about something he had seen moving on the road below his property. 3 or 4 of the deteriorating moving together in a loose group, which was worth noting, because they didn't usually cluster like that. We talked about it for a few minutes. Nobody had a good explanation. And then one by one the others signed off and the frequency went quiet. I sat in the dark and waited. Levi came on at his usual time, a little after 9, his voice carrying that particular quality it always had, tired but alert, like a man who had been walking all day and was determined to stay awake a little longer, because the thing he had to say was worth staying awake for. He said he was making good time. He said he had eaten well. And then he said he had read more of the journals that afternoon while resting, and that tonight's entry was short, but that I should pay attention because he thought it was where things started to change. He read it slowly, the way he always did, pausing at the parts where the handwriting got difficult. It was an early entry, dated almost 4 years before the collapse. And Dr. Phelps was writing about his concerns regarding the long-term stability of a compound that had been introduced into a widely used food preservation additive. The language was careful and technical, but underneath it was something else, a tightness, a man choosing his words with the awareness that someone else might read them. He wrote that he had raised the issue internally and been told the data was inconclusive. He wrote that he was not satisfied with that answer. He wrote that he intended to keep watching. Levi finished reading and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's where the first notebook ends." He said he would start the second one tomorrow night. He said good night. And the frequency went static. I sat with the radio for a long time after that, not moving, not reaching for anything. Outside the window, the property was dark and still. The goats had settled. The chickens were quiet. The fence held its line in the dark the way it always did. I thought about a man sitting at a desk 4 years ago, writing down something he was afraid to say out loud, choosing his words carefully, not knowing that the thing he was watching was already moving, already inside nearly every processed item on every shelf in every store in the country, already doing whatever it was going to do to the people who ate it. I thought about the ones still out there, moving in the dark, operating on whatever was left of them after the unraveling. Then I turned off the radio, checked the door locks the way I always did, and went to bed. Tomorrow the chores would start again before the sun came up. Tomorrow night Levi would read more. That was enough to work with for now. It had to be. The second doe, the one I called the gray one on account of the patch along her left flank, was off her feed when I went out in the morning. I noticed it before I had even fully latched the pen gate behind me. She was standing at the back of the shelter instead of coming forward the way she usually did. And when I held out a handful of the mixed grain she normally ate out of my palm without hesitation, she turned her head away. I stood there for a moment looking at her, reading her the way you learn to read animals when they're the only ones around to read. Her eyes were clear. She wasn't favoring any leg. No discharge, no visible bloating. I ran my hand along her side, and she didn't flinch, but she also didn't lean into it the way she normally would. I decided to pull her off the morning milking rotation and watch her through the day. Could be nothing. Could be the early sign of something I needed to get ahead of. I wasn't going to assume either way. The other doe gave me a good pull, and I set the milk to cool in the cold room off the back of the house, which I kept at a steady temperature year-round using a combination of the natural grade of the hillside and a small amount of supplemental insulation I had packed in years ago. The cold room was one of the things I was most quietly proud of. It worked without power, which meant it worked no matter what. And that kind of reliability was worth more to me than almost anything else on the property. I had hard cheese aging on the upper shelf, soft cheese in the lower cool section, cured meats hanging from the crossbeam, and root vegetables packed in damp sand along the floor. Walking in there was the closest thing I had to reassurance that I was going to be all right. I spent the mid-morning in the garden. The carrots in the low tunnel were coming along, and I thinned them out, pulling the weakest seedlings to give the stronger ones room to develop. It was slow work, and I didn't rush it. Thinning was one of those tasks that felt like a loss every time you did it, pulling living things out of the ground, but the math was simple enough. 10 weak plants gave you almost nothing. 3 strong ones gave you something worth eating. I had made my peace with that kind of math a long time ago. I worked my way down the row, dropping the thinnings into a small bucket to feed to the goats later. And by the time I reached the end of the tunnel, the sun was high enough to take the chill off the air, and I stopped and straightened and looked out over the property, the way I sometimes did when I needed to remind myself of what I had built here. It wasn't much by the standards of the old world. 40 acres, most of it scrub and secondary growth. A modest house that I had retrofitted over the course of a decade into something close to self-sufficient. The garden, the animal pens, The workshop where I kept my tools and did my repairs, the rainwater system with its 3 storage tanks and its gravity-fed distribution lines running to the house and the garden both. It wasn't much, but it was mine and it worked, and there was no version of the world I could imagine, the old one or the new one, where I would have traded it for something easier. I checked on the gray doe again after lunch. She had eaten a little, which was a good sign, but not as much as I wanted to see. I checked her gums, which were a normal pink, and listened to her rumen with my ear pressed to her side the way I had taught myself to do years ago from a veterinary manual I had read so many times the spine had cracked in 3 places. The rumen sounds were slower than I liked, but present. I decided she was mildly off and not in crisis. Made a note to check her again before the evening milking, and went back to work. The afternoon was for the firewood. I had a good stack already laden, but good was a relative term, and I had learned not to trust relative terms. I wanted 3 cords minimum before the cold really settled in, and I was sitting at just under 2, which meant I had weeks of splitting still ahead of me. I went at it for 2 hours, working through a rhythm that I had refined over years of doing the same work, setting the round, reading the grain, swinging through cleanly, stacking as I went. It was hard physical work, and I was grateful for it. Hard physical work had a way of clearing things out of your head that nothing else could touch. While my hands and my back were busy, my mind went quiet in a way it almost never did otherwise. And that quiet was something I protected. I thought about Levi while I worked, or rather I didn't think about him exactly. I thought about what he had read the night before, the precision of it, the way Dr. Phelps had written about the compound like a man describing a problem he had been handed rather than one he had created, which I suspected was a distinction that mattered to him even if it hadn't mattered in the end. I thought about the phrase he had used, long-term stability, and what it meant in context, and what it implied about the short-term stability having already been established. Someone had signed off on it. Multiple someones, probably. That was how these things worked. I checked the gray doe before the evening milking, and she had finished her feed, which was enough of an improvement that I put her back on light milking duty and got half of what I would normally expect, which I was satisfied with. I made a note to watch her through the next few days and added a small amount of loose mineral supplement to her evening grain just to cover the bases. Animals had a way of working things out on their own if you gave them the right conditions and didn't panic. I had learned that lesson more than once. The evening check-in started with Ray, as it usually did. Ray had a habit of coming on early and filling the frequency with whatever was on his mind while he waited for the others to join. And tonight, he was talking about the group he had seen on the road the day before, the cluster deteriorating, because he had seen them again in the afternoon, or thought he had, further along the same road, heading in the same general direction. He said he didn't like the way they were moving, said it looked more purposeful than what he was used to seeing. I didn't say anything right away. I filed it away. Vera came on a little later, and the conversation shifted to food stores and whether anyone had found a reliable source of salt in the last few months, which was a practical concern that everyone had and nobody had fully solved. Curtis suggested rendering from stored sea salt reserves, and Vera pointed out that most people hadn't thought to store sea salt in meaningful quantities, which was true, and which I was glad did not apply to me. I had 4 50-pound bags in the workshop, sealed in mylar. Sitting on a pallet I had raised off the concrete floor to protect against moisture. Salt was one of those things where more was always the right answer, and I had arrived at that conclusion early enough to act on it. The conversation wound down the way it usually did, practical matters exhausted, the silence between transmissions getting longer, and one by one the voices signed off. Ray last, as usual, saying he would keep an eye on the road situation and report back. Then the frequency settled into its quiet hum, and I sat in the dark back room with the lamp turned low and waited for Levi. He came on about 20 minutes after Ray signed off, and his voice had a different quality than the night before. Still steady, but there was something underneath it, a kind of controlled alertness, the voice of a man who had been sitting with something all day and had decided to bring it out carefully. He said he had covered good ground. He said the area he was moving through was quiet, which out here meant something specific and not entirely reassuring. Because quiet could mean uninhabited or could mean something else was already there and not making noise about it. Then he opened the second notebook. The second notebook started about 3 months after the first one ended, and the gap itself was the first thing that struck me. 3 months of silence between entries. Dr. Phelps had written at the top of the first page of the new notebook, in handwriting slightly less controlled than what Levi had read before, that he had not written anything down in the intervening period because he had not trusted the notebooks to be private. He wrote that something had changed in the working environment. He wrote that the internal review he had requested regarding the compound stability data had been quietly closed without conclusion. He wrote that 2 colleagues who had raised similar questions had been reassigned to other projects in other facilities. He wrote that he was continuing his private analysis on his own time, using his own equipment, and that what he was finding was not making him feel better. Levi paused there, and I heard him take a slow breath before he continued. Dr. Phelps wrote that the compound, when exposed to a common respiratory virus that cycled to the population every 2 to 3 years without fail, underwent a structural change that the original stability testing had not accounted for. He wrote that the change was not immediate. It was cumulative. He wrote that the dormancy period would depend on individual exposure history and consumption levels, but that a conservative estimate placed the activation window at somewhere between 8 and 14 years from initial widespread introduction. He wrote that date, the introduction date, and then Levi stopped reading and said quietly that he had done the math and that the timeline fit. It fit almost exactly. He closed the notebook there and said he would read more tomorrow. He said good night, and the static came back. I sat in the back room for a long time after that, without moving. The lamp threw a small circle of yellow light across the table, and beyond it the room was dark, and the window was dark, and outside the window the property was dark, and somewhere past the fence line the world was dark in ways that went a lot deeper in the absence of electric light. I thought about 8 to 14 years. I thought about how long the additive had been in the food supply before the collapse. I thought about all the meals, all the years of meals that had carried it into people without a single person who ate them knowing anything was wrong. And I thought about Dr. Phelps sitting at his desk, writing it all down in a notebook. He was afraid to leave anywhere someone might find it, watching the clock run and the window close. And I wondered what he had done next, and I knew that Levi would tell me tomorrow night. And I was not sure I was ready to hear it, but I was going to listen anyway, because not knowing was not something I was willing to go back to. I turned off the lamp. I checked the doors. Outside, something moved along the far edge of the fence line, slow and without direction, and then it was gone, and the night was quiet again, and I went to bed. I saw it clearly in the early light. I had come out for the morning, checked the same as always, boots laced, breath foggy in the cold air, and I had done my usual scan of the property from the porch before stepping off it, and that was when I saw the figure standing at the fence line on the north side, about 2/3 of the way down the long run that bordered the scrub. It was just standing there, not moving, not pressing against the wire, just standing with its arms loose at its sides, and its head tilted at an angle that no one tilts their head when they're thinking about anything in particular. I had seen that posture before, not often, but enough to know what it meant. I went back inside and got the rifle. I didn't go toward it. That was the first rule I had made for myself when it became clear that the deteriorating were going to be a permanent feature of the landscape rather than a temporary crisis. I did not approach them. I did not engage them. And I did not let them see me move with any kind of urgency, because urgency attracted attention in a way that stillness did not. I went around the long way, keeping the outbuildings between me and the fence line, and came up along the inside of the north run from the far end where I could observe from distance without being in direct line of sight. I crouched behind the corner post of the workshop and watched. It was a man, or had been, medium height, wearing what was left of a canvas jacket that had been through weather and worse. His face was turned slightly away from me, and I was glad of that. I had learned early not to look at the faces, if I could help it. The faces were where the recognition lived, the part of your brain that wanted to see a person there and would manufacture one if you let it. And that kind of thinking got you hurt. He was not pressing against the fence, but he was close to it, close enough that I could see his fingers occasionally brush the wire, without any apparent intention behind the motion. He had been there since at least the previous night, based on what I had seen from the window. Maybe longer. I watched him for 20 minutes. He didn't move with purpose. He didn't react to sound. A bird went up in the scrub about 30 feet from where he was standing, and he didn't turn toward it, which told me something about what stage he was at. The later stage, deteriorating, lost the reactive starter response along with everything else. He was not an immediate threat where he was, which meant my options were to wait and see if he moved on or to do something about it before the situation changed. I had a third option too, one I didn't like to use unless I had no choice, and I set it aside for now and went back to the morning chores. I did the chickens first, keeping my movements unhurried and normal, not letting the presence at the fence line change the rhythm of what I was doing. Routine was protective in more ways than one. The chickens gave me 4 eggs, which was better than the day before. I checked on the gray doe, and she was back to normal, eating well, coming to gate when I approached, and I felt a small measure of relief at that which I noted and then put away. I milked both does, got a good pull from each, and carried the milk to the cold room. While I was in there, I took stock of my inventory the way I did every few days, not because I expected to find a problem, but because knowing exactly where I stood was the only way to make good decisions. I was in good shape, better than good shape. 18 months in, and my stores were holding well, supplemented consistently by the garden and the animals. I was not comfortable exactly, but I was stable, and stable was what I had built this place to be. I went back and checked the fence line around 10 in the morning. The figure was still there, same position, same angle to the head. I worked my way along the inside of the fence, checking the connections and posts as I went, doing the job that needed doing anyway, and keeping one eye on him while I did it. He didn't react to my presence until I was about 40 feet away, and then his head came up slowly, not fast, not snapping toward me the way an alert animal would. Just a gradual reorientation, like something receiving a signal from a long distance. I stopped moving. He stopped moving. We stood like that for a moment that felt longer than it was, and then I took one slow step backward, and his attention drifted, and he went back to whatever the deteriorating went back to when the signal faded. I finished my fence check from further away and went back to work. The leak in the secondary rainwater tank was worse than I had thought. What had been a slow seep when I first noticed it 2 weeks ago had widened into something that was losing me a meaningful amount of water every day. And with the dry stretch we had been in, that was not a problem. I could keep patching around the edges. I drained the tank down to a workable level, cut out the damaged section of the liner, and spent most of the afternoon making a proper repair with the patching material I had stored in the workshop specifically for this purpose. It was finicky work, the kind that required patience and careful attention to detail, and I was glad to have something that demanded my full concentration. By the time I had the tank refilling from the collection lines, the light was going gold and low and my back was aching, and I was satisfied in a particular way that comes from fixing something properly instead of just making it whole for a while longer. The figure at the fence was gone when I did my evening perimeter walk. I didn't know when it had left or where it had gone, and I made myself be honest about the fact that not knowing bothered me more than the presence had. A known position, even an uncomfortable one, was easier to manage than an unknown one. I added it to the mental map I kept of the area around the property, the places where the deteriorating had been seen, and the directions they had moved, and I noted that this one had come from the north, and that the north side of my property backed up against a long stretch of secondary road that eventually connected to what had been a small town about 8 miles out. I had not been to that town. I had no plans to go, but I thought about it sometimes the way you think about a bruise you are trying not to press on. The evening radio check-in started with Curtis, unusually, and his voice had a tightness to it that I noticed immediately. He said he had seen 4 of them that morning, not clustered the way Ray had described, but moving in the same general direction, north to northeast, spread out across a wide area, but all tracking the same line. He said it was the most he had seen in one morning since the first weeks after the collapse. Ray came on and confirmed he had seen 2 more on his end, same direction. Vera said she had not seen any, but that she had heard sounds in the night that she had not been able to identify and that she had not liked. I told them about the one at my fence line, the fact that it had been there overnight and into the morning, and then moved on. Nobody said what we were all thinking, which was that things might be shifting in some way we didn't have a framework for yet. We talked around in the practical language we had all settled into, observations and data points and cautionary notes, and then the check-in wound down and the frequency quieted. I sat with the radio for a while before Levi came on, thinking about the directional movement, north to northeast. I pulled that line in my head and traced it, and did like where it pointed in a general sense, which was toward the denser population areas that had been the hardest hit in the early months. I had no way to know what was driving the movement or whether it meant anything coherent at all. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was weather or food source or some degraded remnant of migratory instinct that had survived the unraveling when everything else hadn't. I didn't know and I couldn't know, and I made myself set it down and wait for Levi. He came on at his usual time, and he sounded tired in a way he hadn't before, a bone-deep tiredness that came through even over the static and the distance. He said he found a good place to rest for the night, said the area was clear as far as he could tell. Then he opened the second notebook, where he had left off. Dr. Phelps had written the next entry 2 weeks after the previous one, and the change in tone was immediate. The careful clinical distance was mostly gone. He wrote that he had tried one more time to raise the issue through official channels, this time going above his direct supervisor to a department head he had believed he could trust. He wrote that the meeting had lasted 11 minutes. He wrote that he had been told in language that was polite and precise and completely unambiguous that the program was operating within all established parameters, and that his private analysis constituted an unauthorized use of proprietary research resources, and that any further escalation of his concerns outside the proper internal review process would be considered a breach of his contract. He wrote that he had driven home that night and sat in his car in the driveway for a long time before going inside. Then he wrote something that made me lean forward in my chair. He wrote that he had decided he was going to document everything, not because he believed anyone in the organization would act on it, but because he had begun to believe that someday someone outside the organization might need to know, and that when that day came, the only record that would exist would be the one he made himself. He wrote that he was going to be careful. He wrote that he was going to be thorough. And then he wrote a name, a specific name, the name of the agency that had approved the additive for widespread use. And next to it, he wrote 3 words that Levi read slowly and then repeated, because I think he wanted to make sure I had heard them correctly. They knew first. Levi closed the notebook and said nothing for a moment. Then he said he would read more tomorrow. Then he said good night, and the frequency went to static, and I sat in the dark with those 3 words sitting in a room with me like something had come in through a door I hadn't meant to leave open. And outside the night was still, and the fence was holding, and I didn't sleep well for a long time after I finally went to bed. I didn't sleep past 4 in the morning, and I stopped try around 3:30, lying in the dark staring at the ceiling with those 3 words still sitting in my chest like something I had swallowed wrong. And by the time I finally gave up and pulled my boots on the sky, outside was still fully black, and the cold had a bite to it that hadn't been there the night before A shift in the air that I noted and filed away because weather changes mattered out here in ways they hadn't when there was infrastructure to soften them. I did the full perimeter walk before I did anything else. Something I didn't normally do in the pre-dawn dark, but that felt necessary this morning. And the property was clear, fence intact, no figures at the wire, nothing in the scrub that I could detect, and I let out a slow breath and went to start the morning chores. The chickens were restless in a way they sometimes got before weather change, and I noted that too. The gray doe was fully recovered, eating aggressively, pressing her head against my hand when I went to milk, and I was glad for the uncomplicated good news of a healthy animal. I got a strong pull from both does, better than the day before, carried the milk to the cold room, and was back outside splitting the first with the morning before the sun had fully cleared the tree line on the east side of the property. I had worked through about 40 minutes of steady splitting when I heard the sound from the north fence line, and I set the maul down without rushing and picked up the rifle that was leaning against the woodpile where I had put it before starting work, because I had started keeping it within arm's reach at all times since the morning before, and I moved toward the north fence with the careful, unhurried walk that I had learned was the right way to approach most things out here. There were two of them this time. One was pressed against the wire near the corner post, both hands flat against it, head down, and the other was about 15 feet further along the run, standing the same way the one from yesterday had stood, loose and directionless. The one at the wire was different. It was pushing, not hard, not with any organized force, but rhythmically, a slow, repeated leaning into the wire that was working the post at the corner, and I could see from where I stood that the post was moving slightly with each push in a way it should not have been moving, which told me that the ground around its base had softened, probably from the rain we had 4 days ago, and that the combination of soft ground and repeated pressure was going to become a problem if I let it continue. I made the decision quickly the way I had trained myself to make decisions out here, standing still for one breath, taking the full picture, and then committing to it without going back, not because I was comfortable with it, but because hesitation had a cost, and I knew what the cost was, and I had paid it once before early on, and I was not going to pay it again. I dealt with the one at the wire first because it was the immediate structural threat, and then I dealt with the other one because leaving it there felt like leaving a problem I would have to come back to. And then I stood in the quiet that followed for a moment and listened to property and the scrub and the road beyond it. And when I was satisfied that nothing else was moving, I went and got my post hole digger and my tamping bar. And I spent the next 2 hours resetting that corner post properly, packing the base, checking the wire connections on both sides of it. And when I was done, it was solid, and I was sweating despite the cold. And my hands were shaking slightly in the way they sometimes did after something like that, not from fear exactly, but from the particular expenditure of something that didn't have a clean name. I ate lunch inside, something warm, and I sat at the table longer than I normally would before going back out. The afternoon was for the garden, and I made myself do it properly, checking every bed, checking the row covers, checking the cold frame where the lettuce and spinach were coming in well, checking the garlic and onions in the main beds, and pulling a test bulb from the onion row to check sizing. And they were close another week or two, and they would be ready to pull and cure, which was good news that I tried to let be good news, and mostly succeeded. I had planned to work on a repair to a workshop roof that afternoon, but the shaking in my hands had not fully settled, so I found quieter work instead, spending an hour organizing and inventorying the seed storage, checking the Mylar bag for seal integrity, holding each one up to the light the way I always did to look for any sign of condensation or compromise along the seam, finding everything solid and sealed the way it should be. Then pulling out the planning schedule I kept in a binder and going through the next 6 weeks of succession plannings to make sure I had everything staged correctly, making 2 small adjustments based on what the test onion bulb had told me about the timing. Routine, the deep routine of a place that ran on purpose and repetition, and I let it work on me the way I always did. Felt it slowly smooth down the jagged thing the morning had left behind. By the time the light was going, I had done the evening feeding, the evening milking, the evening perimeter check, and I had confirmed that the north fence line was holding and that nothing else was moving in the scrub. And I went inside and made supper, a decent meal, dried beans I had soaked since morning, cooked down with garlic and some cured meat from the cold room. And I sat at the table and ate it slowly and tried to keep my mind on the food and the warmth of the room and the small, ordinary fact of a meal. And I was about 60% successful at that, which I decided to count as good enough. When I sat down at the radio for the evening check-in, Curtis came on first again, and his voice was tighter than it had been the night before. And what he said next was the thing that made the already thin truss on the frequency start to crack in ways I wasn't sure it was going to recover from. Because Curtis said he had been thinking about the journal entries and about the name of the agency that Levi had read out the night before, and he said he thought we needed to talk about whether continuing to broadcast on this frequency was safe, whether the information Levi was sharing was the kind of information that could draw attention from people who might still have a vested interest in it not being spread around. And the silence that followed that suggestion was the loudest silence I had heard on the radio since I found the frequency. Ray pushed back almost immediately, said Curtis was being paranoid, said there was nobody left to monitor radio traffic who had any kind of institutional interest in suppressing anything, said the agencies were gone the same as everything else. Curtis said he wasn't sure about that, and he said it in a way that made it clear he'd been sitting with that uncertainty for a while before deciding to say it out loud. Vera said nothing for a long time, and then said she thought they should all be careful, and left it at that, which was not nothing but was not what anyone needed from her in that moment. I said I thought the information mattered and that stopping now, with the journals only partially read, was not something I was willing to do, and I said it with more edge in my voice than I usually let through on the radio, and I heard Curtis exhale and then go quiet, and the check-in ended without resolution, with a fracture just sitting there in the open between all of us. Levi came on about 30 minutes later, and if he had heard any of the earlier exchange, he didn't reference it, just came on steady and purposeful the way he always did. Said he had covered ground, said he was getting closer to something he would explain when he understood it better himself, and then he opened the notebook. The entry he read that night was the one I had been dreading, without knowing I was dreading it, because it was the entry where Dr. Phelps stopped writing around the thing he knew and started writing directly at it. He had written it 4 months before the collapse, which meant he had known for 4 months what was coming and had not been able to stop it, and the weight of that was in every line. He wrote that his private analysis had confirmed that the structural change in the compound, the change triggered by the common respiratory virus, was not reversible once initiated, that it crossed the blood-brain barrier within a window of approximately 72 hours post-activation and began its work on the prefrontal structures immediately, and that the timeline from activation to full deterioration varied, but that his model suggested most individuals would progress through the stages within 18 to 24 months of activation, with the final stage being what the survivors had come to witness and would recognize without needing it described. He wrote that the agency whose name he had recorded in the previous entry had been provided with a full technical brief of his findings through an intermediary he trusted, and that the brief had been received and acknowledged, and that nothing had been done. He wrote that the additive had not been pulled from the supply chain. He wrote that the quarterly production numbers he had access to through his work showed no reduction in volume. He wrote that he had started keeping food logs for himself and his family, that he had cleared their pantry, that he had told his wife it was an experiment and watched her look at him with a worry she was trying to be kind about. And then Levi paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was not quite steady in the way it had always been steady before, and he read the last line of the entry, which was Dr. Phelps writing that he understood now that there was no version of this that ended well, that the only question remaining was whether the record he was making would survive him, and whether anyone who found it would be in a position to do something with what it contained. Levi closed the notebook and said nothing for a long moment, and then said good night, and the static came back, and I sat in the dark with my hands flat on the table in front of me, and the lamp burning low, and outside the fence the night was quiet and still, and I thought about a man clearing out his pantry and lying to his wife about why, and I thought about what it meant to know something that large and be unable to move it, and I sat there for a long time before I finally turned off the lamp and went to bed. I had not slept more than 4 hours in 2 nights, and I felt it in everything I did that morning, a heaviness behind the eyes and a rawness at the back of my throat and a slowness in my hands that I did not have the luxury of giving into, and I pushed through it the way I always push the things I could not afford, with routine and with work and with the flat practical understanding that the property did not care how tired I was, and neither did the animals and neither did the fence. Line, none of it waited, none of it adjusted itself to my condition. And so I got up before the sun the same as always and pulled on my boots in the dark and went out into the cold gray morning and did what needed doing, because that was what the morning required, and that was the only answer I had. The chickens gave me 5 eggs, which was the best single haul in weeks, and I stood in the coop for a moment with them in my palm and let that be a small good thing before moving on to the goats. Both does were well, the gray one completely back to her old self, pressing into the milking with a focus and indifference that goats brought to everything, and I got a full pull from each and carried the milk to the cold room and stood inside it for a moment in the cool dark, taking stock, not the inventory this time, but myself, which I did not do often and which the cold room seemed to be the right place for. Something about the quiet in the dark and the smell of aging cheese and cured meat that made honest assessment easier. I was tired. I was more unsettled than I had been at any point since the early weeks after the collapse. Not because my situation had materially changed, but because the shape of what I was living inside had changed. The story I had been telling myself about how the world had ended was no longer the whole story, and the new version was harder to carry. I acknowledged that, and then I went outside and got back to work. The garden needed attention I had been deferring for 2 days, and I gave it the full morning, working through every bed systematically, weeding, checking soil moisture, adjusting the row covers that had shifted overnight in the wind that had come up sometime before dawn and which was still blowing cold out of the northwest, bending the onion tops in a way I didn't love, but that wouldn't hurt them. I pulled the rest of the test onions in the row I had sampled the day before and laid them out on the drying rack in the workshop, good solid bulbs with tight necks, and I felt the particular satisfaction of a crop coming in well even as the rest of my mind was elsewhere. I had a hard morning, and I knew it, and I did not pretend otherwise to myself, which was the only honest approach, and I worked through it methodically and without drama. And by noon I was on the other side of it, in the way you sometimes get to the other side of difficult things simply by refusing to stop moving through them, one task at a time, 1 hour at a time, until the morning was behind you, and the afternoon was what was left to work with. I ate lunch at the workbench in the workshop, looking out the small window at the north fence line, and the fence line was clear and the scrub beyond it was still. I had slept badly for 2 nights, and my dreams on both nights had been formless and dark in a way that tired dreams are, not narrative, just weight and shadow, and I had woken from both of them with the specific disorientation of a man who has been somewhere unpleasant and cannot quite locate where the unpleasant thing ends and the waking world begins, and I had lain there in the dark both times running to property in my head, the fence, the animals, the stores, the garden, grounding myself in the inventory of what was real and solid until the disorientation passed. It passed. It always passed. I finished my lunch and went back to work. The afternoon was supposed to be for the workshop roof repair I had deferred the day before, but when I got up on a ladder and looked at the section that needed attention, I found the damage was worse than my ground-level assessment had suggested. 2 of the metal panels had lifted along one edge, and the underlayment beneath them had taken water. And what I had estimated as a 2-hour job was going to be closer to a full afternoon and possibly carry into the next day. And I made the decision to do it right rather than fast, pulling the panels properly, assessing the underlayment damage. cutting out the compromised section and replacing it with material from my repair stock, before relaying the panels and seating them properly with new fasteners. I worked until the light made it unsafe to be on the roof, and then I came down and covered the open section with a tarp. I waited at the corners and told myself it would hold overnight, and believed it, mostly. I was washing up before supper when a radio in the back room came to life outside of the usual check-in window, a voice cutting through the static in the mid-afternoon dead zone when nobody normally broadcast, and I dried my hands fast and went to it. It was Ray. His voice had a quality I had not heard from him before, clipped and too careful, the voice of a man working hard to sound normal. He said he was just checking signal quality and asked if anyone was receiving, and I came back and said I was. And he said, good. And then he said he would see everyone at the usual time tonight. And then he signed off, and that was it. That was the whole transmission, and I sat with the radio for a moment after it ended because something in it had been wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. Ray was not a man who checked signal quality. Ray was a man who talked. The transmission had lasted 45 seconds and contained almost no information and had felt. In some way, I was still trying to articulate to myself, like a man making sure a voice he recognized was still there. I noted it and went to make supper and thought about it through the whole meal. The evening check-in came and Ray was not on it. I waited through the usual opening window and then passed it, and he did not come on. Curtis was there, quieter than he had been the night before, the combativeness from the previous evening replaced by something more subdued that I didn't have a good read on. Vera checked in briefly and said little. I gave my standard report. Fence clear, property stable, weather shifting, and got acknowledgments and not much else. The fracture from the night before was still there, sitting in the silences between transmissions, and nobody was making a move to address it. And I decided that was probably the right call, because the alternative was forcing conversation that none of us were equipped to have in a way that would end well. I asked about Ray directly, said I had caught his midday transmission, and that he wasn't on tonight. And Curtis said he hadn't heard from him, and Vera said the same, and the three of us sat with that for a moment before the check-in ended without resolution, without Ray, without any of the easy familiarity that had made the frequency feel like something worth having. I sat in the dark back room for 20 minutes after the check-in ended, not moving, the radio on low, and I thought about the 45-second transmission and the clipped careful voice and the question about signal quality. That wasn't really a question about signal quality, and I could not make it into something that didn't worry me. I was still sitting there when Levi came on, and his voice was different tonight too, not clipped like Ray had been, but tired in a way that went past the usual travel tiredness. A man carrying something heavier than miles. He said he'd found a good position for the night. Said the area was clear. Said he had been reading the journals all afternoon while he rested, and that what was in them had kept him from sleeping the same way I suspected it had been keeping me from sleeping, and that he wanted to read tonight's entry, and then he wanted to rest, and that he would be brief. He opened the notebook. The entry was short, the shortest he had read so far, and Dr. Phelps had written it in handwriting that was visibly different from the earlier entries, less controlled. The pen pressed harder into the page in a way you could apparently hear in the quality of the pages turning, because Levi said so before he began. Dr. Phelps wrote that he had gone back through the internal communications from the early review period, and that he had found, buried in a chain of administrative emails that appeared routine on their surface, a reference to a secondary study that had never been included in any of the documentation he had been given access to during his time on the program. The study had a reference number, but no attached data in the system he could access. He wrote that the reference number indicated it had been conducted by an external contractor, not by his organization, and that the contractor's designation matched a firm he recognized from his work, a firm that did not do basic research, a firm that did outcome modeling. He wrote that outcome modeling in the context of a food additive program meant someone had run projections on what would happen, and that those projections existed somewhere in a system he could not reach. He wrote that he had requested access to the external study through his internal research portal, and that the request had been denied within 4 minutes, which was not a human response time, which meant the denial had been automated, which meant someone had anticipated the request and built a wall around it before he ever thought to ask. Levi stopped reading and was quiet for a moment, and then said, slowly, that he thought the journals were building towards something specific, that he could feel in the way the entries were tightening, and that he thought the next few notebooks were going to be the ones that mattered most. He said goodnight and signed off, and the static came back, and I sat in the back room with the automated denial sitting in my head alongside the missing ray and the fractured frequency and the lifted roof panels and the deteriorating figures moving north to northeast, and all of it was true at the same time. All of it was a world as it actually was, and I had no way to make it smaller or simpler or easier to hold. So I just held it the way I held everything out here, the way you hold something, when putting it down is not an option. And eventually I turned off the lamp and went to bed and lay in the dark and waited for sleep and thought about outcome modeling and what the projections might have shown and whether Dr. Phelps had ever found that study and whether Levi was going to find the answer in the notebooks before they ran out of pages. I finished the workshop roof in the morning, up on the ladder before the dew had fully lifted, working carefully and without rushing, because a roof done wrong in a hurry was worse than no roof at all, and I had learned that particular lesson early enough that it had not cost me anything I could not recover from, and by mid-morning the panels were seated properly, and the tarp was off, and the repair was solid, and I stood on the ground and looked up at it and felt the quiet satisfaction of a thing done correctly, which was one of the few feelings that had not changed at all between the old world and the new one. The morning chores had gone smoothly before the roof work, both does milking well, the chickens up to 6 eggs again, the perimeter clean and quiet, and I had done the full fence walk with my coffee still warm in my hand, and the property had felt settled in a way that was different from the unsettled quality of the previous 2 mornings. And I noticed that and was grateful for, without trusting it completely, because gratitude and trust were not the same thing, and I had learned to keep them separate. The garden got a lighter touch that morning, just a check and a few small adjustments, because the bigger work was done and what the beds needed now was time more than attention. And time was the one thing I could give freely, because it was the one thing the new world had handed back to me in abundance. I spent part of the late morning doing what I did every few weeks, walking the full perimeter of the property, not just the fence line, but the outer edge of the clear ground, checking for signs of change in the scrub, new paths pressed to the undergrowth, disturbed ground, anything suggesting regular movement in the area immediately outside my boundary. And what I found was nothing unusual, except one spot on the northwest corner, where the vegetation had been pressed down in a way that suggested something had stood or rested there more than once. And I noted the location and the orientation, and added it to my mental map, and went back inside for an early lunch. The afternoon was for preserving. I had onions cured and ready from the workshop rack, and I spent time braiding and hanging them in the cold room, and then I sorted and sealed dried beans into mylar at the workbench, working to the pile methodically, heat sealing the bags and stacking them dated and labeled on the storage shelf. I checked the gray dough one more time before the evening milking, just because I wanted to, not because she needed it, and she was completely herself, curious and pushy and entirely indifferent to my peace of mind. And I pulled a good evening milk from both does and carried it inside and made supper and ate it slowly at the table. And while I ate, I thought about Ray, whose silence had now stretched into a second full day, and I thought about Curtis, whose voice had been going quieter and tighter with each check-in, and I thought about Vera, who had always been the most measured of all of us, and whose measured quality had started to feel in the last few days less like steadiness, and more like a person being very careful not to show what they were actually feeling. And I thought about Levi somewhere out there in the dark, moving through a landscape I could only imagine, carrying a dead man's notebooks, reading out loud to a frequency of survivors every night like a man who had decided that the truth was worth the effort of delivering it, even if he did not yet know what it was going to cost. I washed up after supper and went to the radio early, before the check-in window, and sat in the dark back room with the lamp low and the static soft, and let the quiet of the property settle around me, The goats shifting in their pen outside, the chickens already quiet in the coop, the fence holding its line in the dark the way it always did. All of it steady, all of it mine, all of it the result of years of work and decision-making that had looked like paranoia to everyone watching and had turned out to be the most rational thing I had ever done. Curtis came on first for the check-in, and his voice was flat and careful, and he said that he had decided he was going to cut back his radio time going forward, that he was not comfortable with the frequency of the transmissions and the content of what was being shared, and that he wished everyone well, but that he was going to go quiet for a while. And there was a silence after that, which I let sit for a moment before I said I understood, and that I hoped he stayed safe. And he said the same to me, and then he signed off, and that was the last I heard from Curtis. Vera came on shortly after and said only that she was well and her stores were holding, and her perimeter was clear, and that she would be listening. And there was something in the word listen that felt like a door left slightly open, not a departure, not a full commitment to stay. Just a woman keeping her options available, and I said I was glad and I meant it. Ray did not come on. The frequency sat quiet for the rest of the check-in window, and then went to its waiting static, and I sat with it and did not fill the silence because there was nothing to fill it with that would have been honest. I had been sitting in the quiet for close to 30 minutes when Levi came on, and his voice was the steadiest it had been all week, steadier than I expected given everything. The kind of steadiness that comes not from the absence of weight, but from having decided how to carry it. And he said good evening and asked if anyone was receiving. And I said I was, and Vera's voice came through briefly to say she was there. And Levi said good, said that was enough. And then he said that he had reached the end of the journals that afternoon, and that tonight he was going to read the final entry, and that he wanted to do it once and do it right. And then he was quiet for a moment, as if he was finding the page, and I sat forward in my chair without meaning to, both hands on the table in front of me, the lamp throwing its small circle of yellow light across the surface, and outside the window the property was dark and still, and the fence was holding, and the night was the same night it always was, except that it wasn't, not quite, not tonight. Levi began to read. The final entry was dated 11 days before the first major collapse events were reported publicly, which meant Dr. Phelps had known it was already happening before the news had, which meant his models had been right, which meant the people who had seen his models had also known, and Levi read that part slowly and without comment and let it sit. Dr. Phelps wrote that he had obtained, through means he did not specify, a partial copy of the external outcome modeling study, the one whose reference number had appeared in the buried email chain, and whose access request had been denied in 4 minutes, and that what the partial copy contained was worse than his own projections in one specific and critical way that he had not modeled, because he had not thought to model it, because it had not occurred to him as a biological possibility until he saw the contractor's data and understood what they had been measuring. He wrote that the prion's effect on the prefrontal structures was a known mechanism, the deterioration of impulse and empathy and executive function, the unraveling he had already documented, but that the external study had been modeling a second variable, a secondary effect on a different neural pathway entirely, one that was not expressed in the first stage of deterioration, and that did not appear in any of the subject his own research had covered, because the subject in his research had not yet reached the necessary threshold of accumulation in that pathway. And the threshold, according to the contractor's data, required not 18 to 24 months, but closer to 36, and a collapse had happened at the 18-month mark, and that meant the second stage had not yet arrived, and that meant everything that was out there moving in the dark right now was still in the first stage. And what came after the first stage, what the contractor's outcome model had projected and apparently considered an acceptable variable, was something Dr. Phelps had written about in the careful, precise language of a man trying not to let his own horror contaminate the documentation. And what it described was a deteriorating subject in whom certain deep structural functions reassert themselves in the absence of the higher functions that had suppressed them, specifically the capacity for rudimentary coordination, for simple learned pattern recognition, and for something to study at label with a clinical term that Levi translated in a quiet voice as directed group behavior. And I sat in the dark and understood what that meant and felt the understanding move through me like cold water, and Levi kept reading. Dr. Phelps had written one more paragraph after that, the last thing he'd written in any of the notebooks, and it was not clinical, it was not precise. It was a man writing in plain language because the time for careful language was over, and he wrote that the only facility with the full data set, the complete outcome model, and the complete formula for the compound, including the secondary pathway interactions, was a research annex he named specifically, a location he gave with enough detail to find, and he wrote that he did not know if anyone would ever read what he had written, or if the notebooks would survive, or if the world would still be in a condition where the information could be used by anyone capable of using it, but that he was writing it down anyway, because writing it down was the only thing left to do. And then the entry ended, and the notebooks ended, and Levi stopped reading, and the frequency was silent for a long moment. And then Levi said, in a voice that was quiet and certain and not asking a question, that he was going to find that facility, that he had enough of a location from the final entry to work with, and that he would check in when he could, but that he did not know how long it would take or what the terrain between here and there looked like. And then he said goodnight, and the static came back, and I sat in the dark back room with the lamp burning low and the radio humming its empty frequency, and outside the fence the night was still and the property was quiet, and somewhere out there in the dark beyond my fence line were things that had been people moving in patterns that were about to become something other than random. And I did not move for a long time, and I thought about directed group behavior, and I thought about 36 months, and I thought about how many months had already passed, and I put my hand on the radio and held it there like it was something that could hold me back. The static ran on and on into the dark, and I sat with it, and I waited, and I did not know what I was waiting for except that whatever came next was already in motion and had been for a long time before any of us knew enough to be afraid of it.